In today's video, we're going to be talking about the French defense. We're going to go over 21 different ideas and patterns that you must know if you play the French and how you can improve your positional understanding in this opening. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. So French defense starts after moves e4 and e6. After d4, which is the main move, we go d5 and we are challenging this pawn on e4. From this position, there are four major branches that white can go for. These are knight to c3, knight to d2, e5, and e takes d5. These are all major variations that white can go for, and the main thing is in these positions is that if white ever plays e5, whether that's the advanced variation right now or whether you get e5 from this move order, for example, the structure is the same, and the idea in these positions for white is to generate play on the king side. So what white tends to do in these positions is put the bishop on d3, aiming at the king side, maybe bring out the queen to g4, develop the knight to f3, and even use these pawns on the king side with h4, h5, or even f4, f5, and challenging this pawn on e6. But the main idea for white is to generate play on this side of the board, while black plays on the queen side with ideas like c5. So in this position, let's say f4 is played by white, we go c5, and let me just go a couple of moves forward. The main idea for black, though, is to generate counterplay on the c file. Later on, this rook will go to c8, or a queenside expansion with moves like a6 and b5. This is also a very reasonable way to play here. Let's say queen to d2, we go a6, queenside castle, we exchange on d4, we exchange again, and we go b5. So black is trying to create play on the queen side and down the c file, while white will try to create play on the king side. This is a major concept that is applicable in any of the advanced variation positions. Next very important idea that we have to talk about is the French bishop, which is this light square bishop on c8. So in a lot of lines, this bishop on c8 is a problematic piece. Why? Because it is stuck behind this pawn chain of f7, e6, and d5. It cannot get out. You cannot play a move like e5 to liberate this bishop. So this piece usually becomes very passive. And a lot of variations in the French defense revolve around liberating this bishop, making it more active, putting it on a more active diagonal, or trading it off for the white counterpart. So let's say we play bishop to d7 here, our opponent plays knight to f3, we continue with a6, and let's say white plays this move bishop to d3. In this position, we can play this move bishop to b5 right away. Even though this does break some opening principles, you're not supposed to play with the same piece multiple times. However, in this case, because we are trading off our bad bishop for our opponent's good bishop, this is permissible, and this is very good strategically for black. And let's say here white castles, we trade on d3, and here we continue normally with moves like c5, knight c6, and we play a normal game while we traded off our bad bishop. Of course, this idea benefits black. Let me show you another example of this. So let me just go to this position right here. I'm just going to skip forward. Earlier, I showed you an idea where this bishop goes out to d7 and then b5, but there are some cases where you can play b6 as black and bring the bishop out to a6 instead. So this is another way that you can trade your bishop off. You don't necessarily have to go bishop d7, bishop b5. It's more situational depending on what your opponent plays. And in this position, if white castles, we would capture on d3, and once again we achieve this scenario where we traded off our bad bishop, which is the French bishop. To expand on the idea that we were talking about previously, what white can do in order to avoid a bishop trade is that after b6, white can give this check on b5. Now, when we give this check, our goal on b5 is not to trade either on c6 or d7. Let's say black plays bishop to d7. Our goal is to actually go back to d3 now. And this inclusion of bishop to b5, bishop d3 benefits white because you can no longer go bishop to a6, you can no longer go bishop b5 because that square is controlled, and this bishop trade is harder to execute for black. If you block with the knight, a very similar thing happens. We don't necessarily want to take here. If anything, if we ever get attacked, we just want to drop back to either d3 or e2. We just simply go back, and with this idea, with this maneuver of giving a check and then going back, we are avoiding a bishop trade, which benefits white strategically. Next idea I want to talk about is castling queenside for black in order to avoid an attack on your king. So we know that in the advanced French positions, when the pawn has advanced to e5, the main goal for the white pieces is to generate play on the king side. Can we avoid that by castling queenside? And the answer is yes, but you have to be very, very careful. So first of all, in order to be able to castle queenside and be safe with the black pieces, you have to lock the center. You have to play c4. After c4, the bishop has to move. And then this move is not something you have to play, but it is a very useful move. Bishop to a4. This is a very, very nice positional move, and it accomplishes two things. Number one, it puts pressure on c2 pretty much forever. The pawn on c2 is going to be a target forever. The queen is going to be tied down to defending this pawn. Secondly, this pawn on a3 can no longer move to a4, which means that this bishop cannot be developed to a3 on this very powerful diagonal. So this bishop is very powerful on a4, and after a move like, let's say, h4, we will continue developing. We will stop this pawn with h6. We will develop our queen to c7, and then we will finally castle queenside. And in this position, black is completely safe. There's nothing that white can do in order to put the black king in danger, at least right away. Even if you try moves like rook to b1 in order to try to get an attack on the b file, it's not going to work. We can even go a5 just to take space on this side of the board, control this square on b4, and we can even play moves like knight to a7, and then we can even play moves like king to b7 because this pawn is protected. All of the squares on the b file are controlled. This knight can even go to c8 in order to defend the pawn even further, and this is a very nice position for the black pieces. There is nothing you can do with white in order to put this king in danger. So what's funny is that even though this looks dangerous, it's not, and even though castling kingside looks safe, it's also not very safe over there. There is a lot of pressure and there is a lot of possibility for an attack. However, when you're on the queen side and the center is locked, you're actually completely safe in a lot of these win-hour positions. Another key idea in the advanced French positions is pressuring this pawn on d4. And what I want you to notice is that every maneuver in this position is designed to put pressure on d4. So for example, c5 puts pressure on d4, knight c6, pressure on d4, bishop d7 is a normal developing move, and then we play knight to e7 to maneuver it to f5, where it once again puts pressure on d4, and then we play queen to b6, once again putting the pressure on d4. So this is a key idea in the advanced French positions because this pawn is typically a target, and in this case a3 was a mistake earlier, and black is actually much better because this pawn cannot be defended. The only way you can defend it is with bishop e3. That drops the pawn on b2, and this is a completely winning position for the black pieces. And this idea of pressuring d4 is the most important idea in the French defense in the advanced variation. Idea number 6 is about this knight on g8 and where you should develop it. So this knight goes to e7 in a lot of positions, and here there is a question being asked. Do we want to put this knight on f5 or do we want to put this knight on g6? Because we cannot keep it on e7, that blocks our bishop. So if white captures on c5 early, we should always put this knight on g6. We should never put it on f5 if we have the option to do so, because there's no longer a pawn on d4 to pressure. Instead, we put it on g6 where it pressures e5. Now this pawn becomes a target because the queen can also go to c7, and with the help of the queen, the knights also put a tremendous amount of pressure on this pawn on e5. Going back, we also have the option of taking on d4 and then putting the knight on f5 if our opponent castles instead of choosing to capture on c5. However, this comes at the cost of allowing our opponent this square on c3. So now knight to c3 becomes a possibility, and this knight is just a very nice piece on c3. Earlier that was not an option for white because there was a pawn in the way, as you can see. So what you can try to do is play a move like knight to f5. However, the problem with knight to f5 is that it allows white to capture on c5, and now your knight is kind of misplaced. So there's a give and there's a take. You cannot have everything at the same time with the black pieces. You have to accept some sort of a concession. However, there is something you should remember. If there's a pawn on d4, let me just go back here. If there's a pawn on d4, you want to put the knight on f5. If there is no pawn on d4, you want to put knight on g6, pressuring e5. Okay, now let's move on to the exchange French, and in the exchange French, you can attack this bishop on d3 to gain a tempo, and not just one tempo, you can gain multiple tempi. So after a move like knight to b4, we are attacking this bishop on d3. Now white can just simply castle. However, this is positionally not great for the white pieces because we capture on d3, let's say queen captures, and we simply continue developing with bishop to d6, and then knight to e7, we can castle, and we have the bishop pair as the black pieces, which gives us a slight advantage. However, what white will do instead is white will try to preserve this bishop, which means that white will most likely try to go back to e2 or give a check on b5. Let's assume white goes back to e2. We can play this move bishop to f5. Now we are winning a second tempo because we are developing and creating a threat on c2 at the same time. White will play knight to a3, defending, and then we can go back. We're threatening to capture the knight on a3 and ruin white's pawn structure. If white just castles, that is exactly what we will do. But if white just goes back, let's just go back to b1 just like this, we have won multiple tempi, and actually we are ahead in development with the black pieces, which is quite unusual. So it's not a winning advantage, but this motif of going knight to b4 and then bishop f5 allows you to get a very active position and play for a slight advantage in the exchange French variation. Another very important piece configuration that you should remember is having the knight on e7 and putting the pawn on f6. And in this position, pawn to f6 is the best move, and this has a couple of ideas in mind. First and foremost, with f6, you're controlling the g5 and the e5 squares, which means that the knight and bishop cannot go to g5, the knight cannot go to e5. Also, you're stopping any tactical ideas which could happen on h7. For example, if you castle here, there's a tactic. Bishop takes h7, knight to g5. If the king goes back, there's queen takes h5, leading to checkmate in a couple of moves. If the king goes forward, then there is g4, and this king is very, very exposed. White has a winning position here. So this is a very bad way to play with the black pieces. That is why you need to play this move f6 in order to control these squares and disallow any tactics on your king. And then let's say white plays knight to d2. Now you can castle queenside and the game continues from there. You even have a square on f7 that you can go to if you need to. So this f6 move is very, very useful. Another way for white to challenge this pawn on c5 is with this idea of playing a3 and b4. So white plays a3, let's say bishop to e7 by black. White plays b4, challenging this pawn. Now black has a couple of options to deal with this. First and foremost, capturing on b4 is always going to be positionally good for the white pieces because we can capture with the a pawn. This helps us open up our rook. We have a very strong and stable center. We can go b5 in the future, kicking this knight out, and this is a very nice position for the white pieces. So there are two ways to handle this position with black. You either have to capture on d4 and allow this position, or you have to play this move c4 and allow this position, which is also slightly better for the white pieces. Personally, I think that the best way to respond to this a3 b4 threat is to capture on d4, and then from here you go into typical French ideas with knight h6, knight f5, putting pressure here, maybe queen to b6. However, this idea of playing c4 is also another very strong alternative, but capturing on b4 will always lead to a better position for the white pieces. White also has a very cool maneuvering idea of bringing this knight from b1 to a3 to c2. However, this has to be done correctly, and this has to be done when black plays this move knight to e7. And the reason why we have to wait for black to play knight e7 is because the knight on e7 blocks the bishop, which means that we can play knight to a3. Let's say our opponent goes knight to f5. Here we can play knight to c2. And what I want you to notice is that after this exchange, the knight on c2 defends the pawn on d4, and it's just a very nice, well-placed piece, and this bishop can no longer capture it because we moved it away. However, if we were to go back here, let me just go back to this position. If we were to play knight to a3 too early, what black will do is capture on d4 and then capture on a3, and we get into this position. Now, even here, there are some ideas of sacrificing the pawn on a3 and playing this position, which is actually somewhat dangerous for the black pieces because black has traded off his strong bishop. However, black is up a pawn here, and with perfect play, this should be an equal position. It is still very difficult though for the black pieces. This is not easy at all. So this is another way to play with the white pieces. However, if you want to avoid that, you can wait for black to develop the knight to e7, not here, sorry. After bishop e2, knight e7, you can wait for black to block his bishop, and then you can go knight a3, and then you can maneuver the knight to c2, and then you can go bishop to d3, you can go g4, and you can start some sort of an attack on the king side. Another very important way to create play with the black pieces is to play this move pawn to f6. Now, what does this move accomplish? After pawn takes, knight takes, what have we gained in this position with the black pieces? First and foremost, our knight is no longer on d7. If we go back, I want you to notice that this knight is a little bit misplaced because it doesn't have any good squares. Sometimes in some variations, this knight goes to b6 in a lot of positions, but that is a bit difficult to accomplish right now. And this knight on f6 is quite active. We have also gained this square for the bishop, so bishop to d6 is a very nice move. And we can also castle, and our rook will be on a very active semi-open f-file, and we have lots of opportunities to generate play while still having typical French defense ideas of pressuring d4. For example, in this position, we can still go queen b6, we can still go bishop d7, we can still pressure c4, and we can create some very active play by putting the rook on c8, putting the queen on b6. Let me just make different color arrows so everything is clear. We can do all of these moves and we can still play a normal game while having more active pieces on this side of the board. Sometimes white can even sacrifice the pawn on d4 in order to gain a lot of activity. So in this position, after castles, black can take this pawn on d4, and after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, knight to f3, queen b6, this is going to be a very, very active position for the white pieces. After a move like rook to e1, bringing the rook into play, overprotecting the pawn on e5, bishop to e7, queen to c2, attacking h7, disallowing black to castle, h6 to deal with that threat, and then bishop to e3 attacking the queen. As you can see, white is developing with tempo. So here bishop to c5 and a very simple rook to c1, further attacking this bishop on c5, captures, and now white has finally gotten rid of the only annoying minor piece by black. The dark square bishop was the most powerful minor piece for the black pieces. Now black is left with this bishop on c8, which is very bad. Black is also left with this knight on d7, which cannot even go to c5 because that square is controlled by the white queen and the white rook. And this rook is struggling to develop develop. This rook will also potentially struggle to develop because even if you castle, you can't exactly bring this rook out anywhere. White has massive compensation here, and this is going to be a very comfortable position for the white pieces. Next up, I want to talk about this queen on d1 and how it is very powerful on this g4 square. So in this position, there are many moves that can be played for white, but queen to g4 is the most popular move. The queen on g4 is very powerful. Why? Because it attacks the pawn on g7 and it disallows the black king to castle. Now, technically, the black king can castle and it is not a bad move. However, you're inviting a very dangerous attack on yourself, which you're going to have to defend. You're going to have to get into positions where you're constantly under pressure and you're constantly defending. So these positions are extremely dangerous for the black pieces. So going back, the reason why queen g4 can be played in a lot of positions is because this pawn is on e5, blocking the pawn on e6, which means that this bishop can never attack this queen on g4 because the e pawn can never move. So this is a very powerful queen on g4. It restricts black's options. One of the best moves in this position and a theoretical move is this move king to f8. But if you have to play king to f8, now you're playing a very uncomfortable game, although this is not necessarily a bad option for the black pieces. The queen on g4 is just that powerful. Next idea I want to talk about might look a bit strange, but it actually isn't strange at all, and once I explain why, you will understand. So in this position, one of the best moves you can play is this move knight to h6. Now, when you play a move like knight to h6, you're going to be asking yourself, okay, after bishop takes h6, pawn takes h6, we have double isolated pawns on the h file, and this is supposed to be theoretically awful for the black pieces. But that's not necessarily true, because you have to look at what we gained for these doubled pawns. Yes, these doubled pawns are not so great. However, in exchange for these doubled pawns, now we have the bishop pair. We're going to have this bishop which will go to g7, and it will become very powerful after we play f6. So this dark square bishop will become powerful in the future. And we also have the semi-open g file to try to generate an attack on the white king if white castles kingside. So for example, in this position, let's say bishop to e2 is played, bishop g7, castles, and here let's say a4 expanding, we capture on d4, and then we play this move f6, and after ef6, rook f6, now as you can see, once the rook moves, the bishop opens up, the bishop will be attacking the pawn on d4 along with the knight and the queen, and this rook can always go back to f7. It can always also go to g6, pressuring the king, but most likely the rooks will be doubled on the f file, and this is going to be very powerful. This rook can even go to f4 at the correct moment in order to pressure this pawn on d4. Of course, you don't want to blunder your rook, so you would play rook a to f8 first. So this is a very comfortable position for the black pieces because you are very, very active, and for these doubled pawns, you have gained so much more in return. One of the coolest ideas in the French defense is this exchange sacrifice on f3. Now, of course, you need to get into a situation where you play f6 and you open up the f file for your rook in order to actually execute this idea and in order to even have the opportunity to execute this idea. Now, in this position, it is white to move. Let's say white plays this move, queen to c2, attacking the pawn on h7. Now, here in this position, we can take on d4, that is correct, but we can take on f3 first, ruining white's pawn structure, and then we can take on d4. Now we are attacking the queen, and we're also attacking the pawn, so queen to d1 has to be played, and then we go knight to e5, attacking this pawn once again. Here, bishop to e3, just developing. However, this does not help. We go knight takes f3, and we do this very, very cool maneuver of queen to b4, and then queen to h4, and the attack continues here. And this is going to be extremely dangerous because nobody's going to be able to stop knight takes h2, knight f3. There are so many attacking ideas here. It's not even fair for the white pieces. So this idea of sacrificing the rook on f3 is very rare, but it comes comes up from time to time, and whenever you have the opportunity to do it, you do not want to miss it. Now I want to show you another idea, and I want to give you a way to pick apart this structure right here. And the move that I want to show you is not f6 in this case, it is actually this move g5. Now after pawn to g5, what I want you to notice is that the c pawn is attacking the pawn on d4, the g pawn is attacking the pawn on f4. So let's say this pawn is taken with the knight. If knight takes pawn, which looks like a very natural move, we go c takes d4, bishop d4, we exchange on d4, and now we go bishop to c5, and we go queen to b6, so getting a very fast development, and also threatening this move, bishop to e3. The only good move in this position is this move, knight to d1, protecting against that. Queenside castles would lose the queen right away, and any other move, let's say knight to f3, will lose the pawn on f4, and then this pawn will be under pressure, and this is a very uncomfortable position for the white pieces, so this is not something that you want to do. And despite the fact that you're technically down a pawn here, you have massive compensation because you are the only one with a light square bishop. Your opponent does not have the light square bishop, and that gives you greater control over light squares. This is extremely dangerous for the white pieces. Now going back, if instead of knight takes g5, pawn takes g5 is played, now we capture on d4, and now what I want you to notice is that after knight takes d4, both defenders of the e5 pawn are gone, because the pawn was protecting the pawn on e5, the knight was also protecting the pawn on e5, but after this exchange, both of those defenders are gone, and we can take on e5, and we have a very nice position. Let's say bishop to e2, bishop to b7, both sides simply developing, and the game continues from here. Of course, this is not completely winning for black or anything like that. However, you have greatly reduced the amount of control that white has, and you have greatly reduced the pressure that white has in this position, because going back, look at this center, right? Look at this huge center. This is very uncomfortable for the black pieces, but with g5 and the sequence that I just showed you, the whole pressure is gone. A lot of it is gone, and after, let's say, if white castles in this position, we have ideas like bishop to g7, knight to c4 in the future, and this is just a very nice position. There's not a lot that our opponent can do in this position. We can even castle here, it is not a problem, and we are going to play knight to c4 very, very soon, and this is just very nice for us. Knight to c4 immediately perhaps does not work, but it is still a very nice idea, which would give us the bishop pair, but we have to play it at an appropriate moment. Earlier, we talked about how we can sacrifice the pawn on d4 as the white pieces in order to get some very active play and get some compensation. And we also talked about the idea of having the queen on g4 and the queen on g4 being very, very powerful. So let's combine these two ideas into a very cool third maneuver that I'm about to show you. So after castles here, cd4, cd4, knight takes d4, we sacrifice the pawn as the white pieces, knight to f3, queen has to go back, and here we play this move, queen to a4. And after bishop to e7, just simply developing and trying to castle with black, we will go queen g4. Now, because our knight was on f3, we couldn't just jump over it, unfortunately, and go to g4. However, in this case, we have this maneuver of queen a4, queen g4, and this allows us to attack the pawn on g7 and also put tremendous pressure on this position. So let's say castles here, that would lead to this move, bishop to h6, and we would win an exchange here, and this is an advantageous position for the white pieces. So this is a very, very cool maneuver that allows us to get our queen. Let me just go back here. It allows us to get our queen to g4 with this knight still being on f3. So this is a very nice maneuver, and white gets a very active position. Earlier, we talked about how you can castle queenside in order to avoid an attack on your king. Well, in this case, you can still castle queenside, but you're not necessarily avoiding an attack on your king. You're actually going to be going into a pawn storm where white pawn storms on the queen side, you will pawn storm on the king side, and you will both attack each other and try to open up each other's king in order to checkmate it. Now, in this case, we have the exchange variation of the French defense, where it's notoriously difficult to generate play as the black pieces. So castling queenside allows you to create some imbalance in the position, and it allows you to go for opposite side castling situations where both sides are going to be attacking each other. Idea number 19 is going to be about controlling the light squares on the queen side. So in this position, a very common move is this move a3 by white. We talked about this earlier, where white plays a3 b4 in order to challenge this pawn on c5. And a very nice response here by black is this move c4. Now when we play c4, we're aiming to control the light squares over here. We're aiming to control d3, we're aiming to control b3, and after bishop to e2, we're going to go knight to a5. Potential ideas of bishop to a4 exist if the queen loses the control of this a4 square, and just to control these light squares. That's very, very important. Let's say knight b to d2, and both sides just simply develop here, rook to b1, and white is preparing this move b4. We would capture en passant, and what happens right now is that after knight takes b3, we go bishop to a4, and we are controlling the light squares so well. So I don't want you guys to remember all of these moves by heart, like knight e7, knight f5. I want you to remember ideas, and I want you to understand why these moves are played. When we go en passant, all of these squares are weak. The square on b3 is weak. The square on c4 is weak. We aim to control these light squares, and even though we're not necessarily castling right away, that is okay because the center is closed and the king is very safe because white cannot attack us in the center right away. So we are completely safe in the center for now. If we were to play c4 in a different position, let me go back. We played c4 after our opponents played a3, right? But if we were to play c4, let's say here, this would be a really bad move. Why? Because a3 has not been played, the light squares have not been weakened. So in this position, white would play this move pawn to b3. After pawn to b3, if we were to take, this helps white because this is structurally much better for the white pieces. The rook opens up. White has a tremendous amount of control over the center of the board. This pawn chain is also very, very strong. So this is a very good position for the white pieces. So this move c4 would be challenged right away. We have to play this move b5, and after castles, even this is a little bit uncomfortable. We do keep our structure here, but it is a little bit uncomfortable for us because we're not necessarily going to be playing a pawn break of b4 or something like that over here. So this is going to be very difficult because we can't get a pawn break on this side of the board, because if we were to play a move like b4, then c4 would be weakened, and this is sort of an advanced concept, but it is something that's still very, very important. So I don't want to go off topic too much. In this case, c4 is very, very strong against a3 because now if b4 is ever played in these situations, we can go en passant, and the light squares on this side of the board are very, very weak, and we can try to take advantage of them. Another crucial idea that you have to remember if you play the advanced French with the black pieces, and this is an idea that's relevant in Caro-Kann as well. In general, in these structures, when the knight is already on f5, you want to play this move h5. And what this aims to do is that it aims to control this square on g4, not allowing our opponent to play g4 and kick our knight out. This is very important because our knight maintains this very, very strong square on f5. But even if our opponents play this move g4 and we are not able to control g4 in time, that is also still okay because we have this move knight to h4. This is another important idea that you should remember, because that means that you don't need to be worried about this move g4 because you always have this resource of knight to h4. And what this aims to do is simply trade off the knight that was on f5 for the knight on f3. We are removing one of our attackers from d4, but also we are trading this knight for this knight, and this knight on f3 is a defender of d4, so this is a very nice trade. If a move like bishop to d3 happens, for example, we can take on f3 and we can continue with moves like queen to b6, or even moves like bishop to e7 would be fine, but putting pressure on this square right away might be better. At first queen e3, and now we can play moves like bishop to e7, we can play f6, we can even playing castle queenside, we have lots of options. And if I were to go back here, if our queen is on d8 but our bishop is on e7, let's say we have this position right here and g4 is being played, we can still go knight to h4. In this case we would take back with the bishop. You have to watch out if g5 ever works, because if g5 works and the bishop is getting trapped, then you might be in trouble. However, that's a bit rare and you just have to watch out for this, and in this case that's not even possible. We can always drop the bishop back and our bishop is completely safe on h4.